Water beats fire, fire beats grass, grass beats water. Rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper, paper beats rock. The idea is simple. Fire Emblem has this as well in the weapon triangle, or triangles since a few exist, but the main one involves swords, lances, and axes. In the world of Fire Emblem, swords beat axes, axes beat lances, and lances beat swords. This adds a layer of tactical decision as a player needs to consider what weapon to use to gain an advantage. The weapon triangle has been a part of the series for so long that it seemed a little strange when it was removed for 3 houses. According to the developers, this was because it was unrealistic. Today's question then, what's the deal with Fire Emblem's weapon triangle? Is it a realistic representation of how weapons work? Short answer, more or less, yeah. Long answer, it's not that simple. First, why was the weapon triangle considered unrealistic? In a talk with GameSpot, Intelligent Systems Director Toshiyuki Kusukihara had this to say. We think that the weapon triangle is somewhat of a stylized system. It isn't really realistic. If you have a situation where a novice axe user takes down an advanced lance user, well, that makes sense? Probably not. So we wanted to make something that comes across as more realistic to warfare. A skilled fighter will always have an advantage over a novice, regardless of the weapons they use. Which is fair, but there's already a system to represent this, character levels. After all, a 2020 Hector isn't going to lose to some sword scrub no matter what the weapon triangle says. But if the two were at similar levels, the story might be different. It probably won't be because it's Hector, but you get the point. So, Kusukihara might have missed the mark. It isn't that the weapon triangle will always determine the winner, but that it gives certain advantages which should be considered. The question then isn't if the weapon triangle is representative of warfare, because of course it isn't. Put simply, there are too many other things to consider. The actual question is whether the weapon triangle represents any real relationship that exists between swords, axes, and lances. A few things first. One, we're focusing on medieval-ish European weapons, since a lot of fantasy, and Fire Emblem in particular, is based on medieval-ish Europe. However, the things discussed do apply more broadly. And two, I've been practicing and teaching historical European martial arts for a while now, and I spend seriously way too much time looking into how historical weapons were used. I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I'm not just making stuff up either. So, what does the weapon triangle actually represent? To me, the weapon triangle isn't about the actual weapons per se. Rather, it's more about the way you fight with certain weapons and how to get the most out of them. Obviously, if you manage to not get hit while hitting the other guy, you win. But there are many ways of doing this, and some ways work better or worse against others. So, what are these styles? Broadly speaking, I'd say there are 3 styles, which for convenience I'll call spacing, control, and rushdown. Spacing involves keeping your opponent as far away as possible and stopping them from getting close enough to hit you. Obviously, a longer weapon is better for this, so spears and lances tend to make the best spacing weapons. Control involves actively dealing with different angles or lines of attack. This one's a bit too complicated to discuss in detail, but the idea is to protect an area and present enough threat to make an opponent not want to be there. As a general rule, swords make the best control weapons. They're quite wieldy, so you can move between protecting and threatening different lines and angles quickly and easily. And you do see this in sword manuals, which tend to talk about different openings to be attacked or defended. Lastly, rushdown involves trying to get close to your opponent and overwhelming them with aggression. This can be quite risky, so historically, rushdown weapons tended to be used with shields, which makes things much easier. As you'd expect, axes are really good rushdown weapons because they hit very hard and are very effective for close fighting once you manage to get in there. In theory, these styles work with any weapon, but certain weapons will generally be better for certain styles. And of course, many weapons will be suited to some combination of the 3. A longsword, say, is very effective at both spacing and control. Again, this is just a quick overview. So, how do these styles stack up against each other? In general, spacing beats control. It doesn't really matter how well you control an area if your opponent can hit you from outside that area. Likewise, control beats rushdown. It's very hard to rush in and overwhelm an opponent if they're always presenting a threat. And finally, rushdown beats spacing. If your opponent is determined to get in your face, it can be quite difficult to keep them away from you. And chances are the weapon they have is more suitable to close fighting than yours. In practice though, this can be a bit tricky since spears are pretty damn hacks. Hence why when you look at pictures of big armies, you see a lot of dudes with spears. Again, shields make rushdown much easier. What all this means is that someone using a spear will probably be fighting in a way that gives them an advantage over someone using a sword. The same goes for someone using an axe against someone using a spear, and so on. Again, it's not really about the weapon itself, but the best way to use it. In general terms, the weapon triangle is broadly realistic, and we can say that some weapons provide advantages over others. Obviously, not all weapons fit these categories. Interestingly, Fire Emblem actually represents this with Reaver Weapons, which reverse the weapon triangle. So the Sword Reaver is an axe that's good against swords, a Lance Reaver is a sword that's good against lances, and an Axe Reaver is a lance that's good against axes. How should we understand this? Going back to our idea of fighting styles, the idea is that some weapons can be optimized for a different style than what you'd expect. For example, you could have an axe that's optimized for spacing rather than rushdown, and if you had this sort of axe, you would have an advantage against a sword that's optimized for control. In essence, you'd be able to reverse the weapon triangle, and you guessed it, such weapons do exist. Swords like the Gladius or the Highland Broadsword are very effective rushdown weapons, which makes them a bit better against spears. And yes, these swords were generally used with shields. Spears, like the Partisan or Spontoon, have elements which optimize them for crowd control, which means that they function more like control weapons than spacing weapons, and would be more effective against axes. And things like halberds are basically axe blades on long sticks, which makes them great spacing weapons, and hence would give you an advantage against swords. Finally, for the sake of completion, there are also weapons designed for the last category. First, we have spacing swords like rapiers, which are basically extremely long bits of metal designed to stab your opponent from as far away as possible, much like a spear. Then we've got things like the Dane Axe or Great Axe, which were often given to bodyguards and are really good at controlling an area, since they're damn terrifying. And lastly, we have the Jousting Lance, which is a rushdown weapon, possibly the most extreme rushdown weapon, come to think of it. These don't really have much of an effect on how the weapon triangle is understood, but they do exist and it's nice to acknowledge them. So, there you have it. Is the weapon triangle realistic? Yes. Generally speaking, a sword will beat an axe will beat a spear, and a spear will beat a sword. However, it isn't really anything to do with the weapons themselves, but how they're used, in terms of spacing, control, or rushdown. And yes, an experienced fighter would know that they would need to use the best style for the situation they find themselves in, no matter what weapon they're using. It probably isn't the most important factor, but weapon choice is something to consider when you're trying to figure out how to gain an advantage over your opponents. And I don't know about you, but it seems to me that trying to figure out how to gain advantages is the whole point of a tactics game. So it seems a little strange that the devs would remove something like the weapon triangle. I guess they're focusing less on the strategy and more on other aspects of the strategy RPG genre. Oh well, at least that means we'll always have waifus.